Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide, Sophie? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. And thank you very much for joining this breakout session today. I'm Nicola Perrin. I'm part of the ICODA team. I lead on strategic governance, and it's fantastic to see so many of you with us here today to talk about the landscape of COVID data sharing. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So as you can see, the landscape of COVID-19 data related activities is busy, it's complex, there's lots going on. This was just the number of logos I could fit on this slide. I'm sure there'd be plenty more, all with the virus in the O's and various combinations of that. Apologies to any of you whose logos I've missed off today. It is a particularly busy landscape at the moment, and that brings with it a risk of both fragmentation and duplication. And that means it's particularly important for us all to try and map that landscape, to have a better understanding of what's going on and to improve collaboration and coordination. And that's the aim of our session today. So if we can move on to the next slide. So this is an overview of what we're going to be going through today. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Marta Tufet, the Executive Director of UKCDR, who will talk more about the COVID Circle and their tracker exercise. We'll then come back to me and I'll give you an overview of an initial mapping of the data landscape that ICODA has been doing. And then we're going to have a panel discussion for the rest of the session, which Anne Wozencraft, the new partnerships lead at ICODA, will be leading. Couple of housekeeping things before I start. If you want to ask any questions at any time, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have more general comments, do use the chat function. Otherwise, I hope you can see us clearly. The slides will be up on your screen. So I think, unsurprisingly, there's been a huge investment over the last 6 months in research to tackle COVID. There have been more than 2,000 clinical trials started and over 5,000 studies. And it's really difficult to keep track of what's going on in all that. And that's where UKCDR comes in. UKCDR, the UK Collaborative on Development Research. And we're delighted to have Marta with us today, the Executive Director of UKCDR, who's going to talk you through what they've been doing to try and keep track of the diversity of studies going on in the CODA front. So if I can hand over now to Marta, and if you want to move the next slide over as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, for that introduction. So my name is Marta Tufet. I'm the Executive Director of UKCDR. We're a collaborative of research funders that are interested in international development, and our role is to ensure that there's strategic coherence across the different funders through joint action and collaboration. Today I'm going to talk about the COVID Research and Coordination Initiative, the COVID Circle Initiative, which we have set up in collaboration with IDDO, another funder initiative seeking to coordinate and collaborate across different funders. And this initiative has been set up to strengthen the collective research response to combat the pandemic. There is recognition among funders that there is that need to coordinate to prevent duplication and improve impact. And this needs to facilitate ongoing improved coordination for future infectious disease epidemics and pandemics as well, not just in the current pandemic. Next slide, please. So the COVID Circle Initiative comprises 4 elements. Given the time and the focus of this meeting, I'm only going to talk about the first 2 elements, the principles and priorities and the mapping and analysis. But I'm happy to have offline conversations with others about the other 2, research coordination and learning. Next slide, please. So on principles, so the 2 research funder coordination groups, the UKCDR and IDDO, have agreed on a set of principles to align research funders towards a coordinated effort for supporting high quality research for the most pressing global needs in epidemics and pandemics. These principles are proposed for endorsement by research funders, donors, governments, or any other entities supporting research to address the most pressing needs. They were published in The Lancet and are live on our website at UKCDR. to allow other funders to add best practice guidance or to be incorporated and for funders to sign up to it. And they join up the best practice from across GlobeDR and UKCDR members, and ultimately they aim to improve relevant research outputs. So they range from alignment of global research to local needs and priorities, to considerations around open science and data sharing, all the way to protecting communities and people from harm. So next slide, please. So in terms of the first principle, alignment of global research agendas to local identified priorities, we have been working with a number of partners to track and understand what those priorities are. There was the research roadmap that was published by WHO with GlobeDR, and we have also been working with the African Academy of Sciences and with the Global Health Network to identify what priorities are in different regions and in the African continent. And then just a couple of days ago, the UN Research Roadmap for COVID-19 recovery was published, and we have been contributing to that as well. So we have published a few articles on this, and we're working together to try and really hone down what are the most pressing needs. Next slide, please. So in the context of that, we have developed, in collaboration with GlobeDR, a living database of funded research projects on COVID-19 to help funders and researchers really understand what those gaps and opportunities are, and importantly, inform future research investments. To our knowledge, it's the only resource in the public domain that captures the complete breadth and spectrum of research projects classified against the WHO COVID-19 R&D priorities. As a near real-time resource, it is a crucial enabler for collaboration. It is also complemented by a living mapping review that has been published in Open Research, which provides some baseline analysis, and it is regularly updated on a monthly basis as a new data sets are added into the tracker. And we have also done more in-depth thematic analysis, which were published separately as well around particular themes of interest. So for example, we've done an analysis specifically on Africa. Next slide, please. So this is what the data set is telling us. We have over 5,000 projects from across different 60 funders. Here you can see the different research priorities as identified by the WHO R&D roadmap. And the size of the bubble represents the number of projects. One caveat is that this does not include commercial data sets, so it's primarily based on public and philanthropic funders. But you can see there in a snapshot where the funding is going and where there are potential gaps. So, for example, in the vaccine, in the virus natural history, in the development of therapeutics, and in the social sciences research, there's a large number of projects. Less so in the animal environmental origins and management measures or ethical considerations. But it is important to note that many of these projects have ethical considerations as cross-cutting issues. And there are some of those priorities identified in the WHO, which are currently being carried out within the WHO in relation to ethical considerations, which is potentially why that bubble is smaller. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of what you can see if you go onto our website. So you can search by funder, by priority area of focus, and through specific abstract or titles, and you can see there a snapshot of the different priorities and how they're represented across the different projects. Next slide, please. And we've also got a world map which shows you where the projects are based. And again, here you can search by income group, by funder, by continent, by country, by priority area, and again by abstract. Next slide, please. In all, this track, the principles, the priority setting, the tracker is helping us understand what the landscape looks like. It's helping us understand what the gaps and the priorities are, and therefore identify areas where there might be duplication, where there might be a need for greater coordination, and that's where the other elements come into our initiative around research coordination and importantly learning. How can we improve the system so that in future we can react more rapidly and more effectively? So that's all I have to say about that. I'm happy to take any questions or have any discussions offline on any of these elements. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Marta. And it's a fantastically useful resource. I'm sure many people listening to this session has used it as much as we have. It's great. So it's really helpful to hear you talking about it. Thank you. And if I could move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to turn now to update you about the mapping exercise specifically of data-related activities that we've been conducting with ICODA. As you've just heard, there's a huge amount of research going on, but we were also aware that there was a lot happening specifically around data, and we wanted to get a better handle on exactly what was happening. And not least to ensure that as we set ICODA up, we weren't duplicating anything that already existed and that we were complementing existing initiatives. And we also wanted to use the mapping to help identify potential partners and potential sources of data for the ICODA workbench. So the research was conducted earlier this year over the summer, mainly from July to September, and a huge shout out and thanks to Julia Tomba, who's I think in the attendees today, who conducted the bulk of the research for us, and we really couldn't have done it without her. There was also a lot of sharing information between our existing partners, but it's probably important to say that the research was very much desk-based research on the internet, rather than being able, obviously, at the moment to go and meet people and talk about it. And on the right-hand side here, you see the areas that we particularly mapped, looking at different data platforms, sources, collaborations, and I'll go through each of those today. The one I won't talk about is public involvement, partly because actually the mapping found much less already happening in that area, partly as a result of the pandemic situation, but it's also something that we're doing some further work to explore in more detail, and there's a separate breakout group about that, and the information will be available on our website. If I could move on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to give you a snapshot of what we found today. It's a very high level overview. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the report is available on our website, and we'll be putting the details up on the chat forum later. And the key thing is that we found nearly 100 various data repositories, platforms, databases, data sets that were really relevant to COVID in the research. And that includes a number of different types of data. So we then sort of tried to get a bit more granular, looking at different types of data, whether it was molecular data or patient scale data or population-wide data. And we've categorized our data sets that we were finding into those categories, and all that information will be available. Within the first category of data platforms that I was talking about, it obviously includes all three of these levels of data, through from libraries of drug compounds at one very small scale through to dashboards providing an overview of what's happening at a country level in the number of cases. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I thought it might be helpful just to look in a bit more detail at some of the data platforms that are in the most similar space to ICODA, not least to show how we see, or we think we will fit on the landscape, and to make it clear that we're not duplicating. So our main aim is really to break down the silos, to build links between fragmented data sets, and to make it easier for researchers to access data from multiple sources. And so we're going to be doing that in three ways, as you've been hearing in the panel session just before. First of all, we offer a secure analytics platform, the Workbench, to analyze the data. But as you can see from this slide here, that clearly isn't unique, and we're absolutely not claiming we're the only people to be doing that. We're using a driver project approach, again, as you've just been hearing in the panel, and that focuses on specific research questions, and it's about helping to bring together relevant data sets from wherever they are to answer those specific questions in the workbench. And I think the driver project 2 that Aziz was talking about is a very good example of that, 100 data sets from 37 different countries. And then where that's not possible, and in the longer term, we're also building a federated access approach so that the data doesn't have to move anywhere. We know it's not easy. We're learning from ADDI, the new Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative, which launched this week and uses the same approach, and Iridia is also very actively involved in that. And the aim is to allow researchers to send their analysis to the data rather than moving the data to the researcher. We're not a data repository, but what we do want to do is collaborate with others to help join up the silos. We don't want to create a new data silo. We want to help enable and support researchers accessing data from wherever it is. If I can move on to the next slide, please. So the next bit of the mapping looked at different sources of data and places where there was a lot of data, both with trial trackers and registries. You've heard Marta talking about her tracker. There's some others specifically focusing on clinical trials. The picture here is the IDDO one, which I'm sure Laura will talk about when she joins the panel. I'm afraid this sort of snapshot here doesn't do justice to the brilliant visualization that they've got. It's such a nice tool to be able to see the data and where the trials are in different ways, and it really helps bring it to life. We've also listed out some of the data sets that are very specific to COVID, whether they're in disease registries, what cohorts are doing, biobanks, some of the symptom trackers. And I've put here the logo for the gateway, the HDR UK Health Data Research Innovation Gateway, which is a fantastic way of searching for relevant studies in the UK. It surfaces all the metadata for those studies and allows requests for access to them. And that's the kind of approach that we want to mirror on the ICODA workbench, and having a sort of ICODA gateway eventually. We're not quite there yet, but that's the sort of aim. If I could go on to the next slide, please. So again, this is just a really quick run through of the kind of information that you'll find in our report, information about collaborations, a really large number of collaborations springing up over the last few months, but also some specifically around data scientists and really building the communities of data scientists. And those are the kind of groups that we hope will be able to work on ICODA and really building communities there. And there's another piece about some of the activities that are going on to increase the sort of data sharing policy work to make sure the data is verified. Some of the work that the Research Data Alliance has been doing around data sharing policies, and also GloPDR as well. And again, Steve joining the panel today will be able to talk more about those. And the other piece within that is some overview of work around data standards, because again, there's, as I'm sure you all know, a huge amount going on looking at harmonization of data standards, and we're just keen to sort of get an overview of all the various things that are happening. If we move on to the next slide. So that overview is available in the report. The link will be coming into chat as well, but you've got it up here. It's on our website to download. It's at the moment a high level report to make it sort of easier to access, but we will also very soon be publishing a detailed spreadsheet of all the initiatives that we mention in the report, including a more granular breakdown of where they are and the type of data and web links. I'm very, very aware that this is an initial overview of a very complex landscape, and we're not in any way claiming it's either comprehensive or exhaustive, and we're really keen to work with all of you to make it up to date and as comprehensive as possible. So please do keep letting us know what's missing, what you'd like to see included, other things that we should look at. And then we're really keen to ask you about ways of keeping it up to date going forwards to collaborate on further mapping. And I hope those are some of the issues that we'll be able to pick up in the panel discussion now. So I'm going to ask Anne to join us now. Anne Wozencraft, our new international partnerships lead, and she will introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and also thank you, Marta. Both were excellent presentations and very helpful, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to questions from them. Hello, everybody. My name's Wozencraft. I'm Head of Partnerships at ICODA, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's panel discussion on this very important topic. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists, who I think bring a wealth of knowledge and perspectives to this particular topic. You've already met Marta Tufet as Executive Director of UK Collaborative on Development Research, as well as my colleague Nicola Perrin, who is ICODA's Strategic Governance Lead. And we're also joined by Laura Merson, Head of Data at ISARIC and Executive Director of the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory. And last, definitely not least, Steve Kern, who's Deputy Director of Quantitative Sciences in the Global Health Integrated Development Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So before we begin the discussion, I'd just like to remind everybody again to please put your questions in the Q&A thread. We're monitoring closely and we'll bring those up. And already I see a few have been posted. Following those very helpful presentations from Nicola and from Marta, I wondered if I could invite Laura and then Steve to give a few observations and reflections about what they've heard so far.
Thanks, Anne. It would be a pleasure, and thanks everybody for having me today. I think what I reflect on this landscape that Nicola has presented is really the diversity of initiatives that exist. And as much as that is challenging because it means there's a large number of different systems that people are using, I think that's actually critical to innovation and to ensuring that we have systems in place for the variety of stakeholders to engage with. And so I would very much support that diversity and think that our focus needs to be on interoperability of the information and the data that are available so that we can bring all of those systems together. So to make sure that the information about all of them is available in one place. And that's very much what Marta was presenting with the Circle initiative, is an effort to bring that information together. At IDDO, we're conducting a systematic review of all of the clinical trials that are ongoing right now. Now that's something that a number of people are doing in the context of COVID, but the difference with IDDO is that they are curating all of the data, which I'm sure many people who have ever registered a clinical trial or dealt with ICTRP know. What you pull off of ICTRP is very heterogeneous. And very difficult to get answers out of it or perform any analysis. So IDDO is curating all of that data so that researchers can know the breadth of studies that are underway. This could link to initiatives like Circle, and then also link to all the different individual patient level data repositories that are available. So by making all information available in usable formats, that's something that IDDO is looking to achieve. And then, of course, to host the data sharing platform that IDDO and ISARIC have partnered on to make individual patient level data available. And lastly, I'll just throw in one promotion for the use of data standards. ISARIC have partnered with WHO to create standardized case report forms so that the world is collecting similar information in similar ways. And also we're working with CDISC in order to develop the data standards so that we can name, format, and organize the data in a way that can make it usable across all these initiatives. So making sure that everybody's thinking through what data we're collecting, how, and how we're organizing it and naming it, I think is really important to be able to make these data not just available, but usable. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very, very helpful insights. Steve, may I ask you to contribute?
Yes, thanks, Anne. And I think one of the things we just heard from Laura is the efforts around the process and the creation of the opportunity to enable the analysis to be done effectively, which is really important. And a lot of times, having worked with data scientists, being a data scientist myself, we're anxious to get our hands on the data, to really jump in and do it, right? And really start working together. But there's a whole lot of work that has to go on behind the scenes to make that happen. And it's really hard work and it's really challenging work. And the groups like IDDO have been putting a lot of great effort into actually trying to understand how we can bring that data together in a useful format so that questions can be answered and results can come forward. In the COVID Circle presentation that Marta gave, I looked at that and think about that as shining a light, all right? It's giving a light down a path to where we're seeing what's happening, what's already existing in the world, as a way to sort of identify, here are the places where people are starting to already inquire. Here are the places where perhaps there's not so much inquiry, and maybe we can put some more energy and some more effort so that we can actually get a balance and the focus across that component. And then what ICODA is trying to do in the enablement of that path is essentially to drive, right? So here we're going to give you the Land Rover or whatever the vehicle is that you need to be able to move down that path through the instantiation of this workbench. And as you've heard a number of times from people, the idea of a workbench is not to create a data repository. It's not a data lake. It's actually a space where people can collaborate, bring data into it safely, keep it contained, and then essentially when the analysis is done, have the data returned from where it came, leave behind the artifacts, the results, the insights that have been gained. As Aziz Sheikh mentioned in the opening session, we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy on the bureaucracy. And bureaucracy can be viewed as a negative word, but actually there's important bureaucracy that we need to make sure is respected and understood so the data can be appropriately linked, that people actually feel that their data is being used in a trusted and safe way and an appropriate scientific way to answer whatever question is going forward. If you just throw all that out there and see what happens as a result of it, you can get a lot of misdirection. And really what we want to be able to do is avoid that. We want to be able to make sure that we have a process that's following along, and you'll see this in the discussion of ICODA of what we call the 5 safes, that we have the right environment for people to be able to work, that they're doing the work in a manner that respects the data that was collected, and then also tries to involve as many people who want to participate in that. I see a number of questions that were coming up from the chat related to patients. Can patients get involved? Well, certainly patients can be involved in terms of helping us identify what the questions are that are important to ask and having a voice in that prioritization. Can patients get involved in analysis? Again, this is meant to be an enabling environment. So if people have the right skills that they can bring to bear on a question, we should really try to emphasize the opportunity for that collaboration as much as possible. And I think that's what you're hearing from both Marta's overview of the COVID circle and then also Nicola's presentation of the landscape. I do participate in the GLOPIDAR effort that was mentioned that worked in collaboration with UKCDR on the COVID circle effort. And the point of GLOPIDAR, which emerged out of previous pandemics, all right, is to help to organize the funders in particular and some of the funding agencies so that we can be aligned in our efforts and actually work in a reinforcing way of each other's goals as opposed to a duplicative or not constructive way. And I think it's gone a long way to helping us identify the ways that we can work effectively. And then you're seeing examples of it, as Laura mentioned, in the effort, for instance, with IDDO, and how it can start to aggregate and assemble data in a way that's useful. Our driver projects, which are going on in some of the other sessions at the same time, are also starting to implement those in real time. And that'll be actually part of our test as we go forward, is how we can actually roll these out and have impact and start to address the questions that really need to be addressed across these different platforms.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. That was a very, very helpful overview. One of the central questions, I think, is given how quickly the landscape is evolving and changing, how can we ensure that mapping is kept up to date? And I'd like to bring Marta back in at that point, and then Laura, say what you've learned from your experiences of conducting living reviews.
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, that's a very important question, and one of the reasons why the existence of groups like GLOPIDAR, like UKCDR, are very valuable, where the trust and the understanding of the funders has been built prior to this. So whenever we're putting projects onto our database, we have already had conversations beforehand with the funders. We know what they have in the pipeline, and they're able to share some of those details with us prior to publication, so that we can do our classification and analysis in parallel, so that when the funds are announced, we can click send at the same time, and we can inform the community in real time of what's happening. So that's a really important point, and one where that collaboration effort is extremely important.
Thank you very much. Laura.
And I'd say from our experience of conducting a living systematic review, it requires resources. So there is a serious investment needed, but that investment enables all of the other initiatives, clinical trials in this case, or funding opportunities in other cases, whatever you're consolidating together, it makes all of those other things much more useful. So I think that it's an investment that is worthwhile. And my learned experience is that you have to be careful of what you're collecting, and not to try to bring together every little bit of data that's out there, but actually be very focused and ensure that there's a purpose to all of the information that you're collecting, and that it links together to other initiatives, so that what Marta might need for her funders, that we would collect those information that can feed through then into the individual patient level data that can then feed back through an evidence cycle. So just being smart and focused about what you need.
Thank you very much. And in relation to that, one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A box relates to whether the initiative, the ICODA initiative, is collecting data from private companies. Nicola, I wondered if you might take that question.
Yes, of course. In fact, I was just trying to type an answer to it now. Two different parts of the question. A lot of the consortia are including private companies, and there are a lot of private-public consortia that have sprung up over the last few months, specifically around COVID. And yes, the ICODA Alliance is really keen to open to work with anyone, including public, academia, and private companies. And indeed, Driver Project 1, the first data that we've been given is from pharma companies. So they are opening up access to their data for trials and really leading the way in a way that I think a lot of people have been very surprised how open they're willing to be with their data, which is fantastic to see, and exactly what we would hope to be seeing. So yes, we are agnostic who we work with, just so long as it's opening up access to the best possible data.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, to sort of open it up a little bit more to everybody who's participating today, I think it'd be very helpful to maybe have a poll and to see what kinds of mapping areas would be most useful to be collated. That includes, for example, data repositories, portals, trial registries, COVID-19 collaborations, and data science community initiatives. I think it'd be quite helpful to have a sort of quick check on whether there's a particular interest in those categories. And maybe while we're waiting for that to go up, I'd be interested if maybe Steve or Laura, if you'd like to add anything, where you think, looking at that big landscape, there actually might be areas where there are gaps.
I think, well, what I'll highlight maybe, if it's okay, on is what I believe is most critical. And it's, of course, access to not just aggregate data that one could pull out of the publications, but the individual patient level data that's absolutely critical. And so I think it's really important that we understand where all of these data are being held. And that's perhaps a review of the landscape of repositories, but I think it also needs to involve a review of every trial that has been funded, that has been published, and that's available, and understanding where the data are, because they might not be in a repository that gets captured by some sort of a scoping exercise. They might be on Figshare or in my own personal Dropbox, or the classic is available on request. So I think that we should go broader than the more formalized initiatives that are there and really dig down into those trials themselves to figure out where the rest of the data are.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that. That's a great start, Laura. Thank you. And I think one of the things, and it kind of gets back to the question that Nicola answered as well around private company data. I'm seeing an unprecedented level of collaboration and sharing happening currently in the COVID space. And that I find really heartening to see, because, you know, there's a challenge in terms of sharing data. People put a lot of hard work into collecting data. They don't want to just give it away as a reflection of their own work. They want actually to be able to benefit from the knowledge that comes from that data. So to Laura's point about being able to look at individual level patient data, that requires a level of security, a level of trust, and a level of confidence to be able to do that in a way that still respects the privacy of the individuals who provided the data, that actually respects the hard work of the people that collected it, and facilitates a collaborative manner to do that. That's one of the enabling features that we've put into this workbench, because data we categorize into 3 generalized types, if you will. There's what we call type 0 data, which is open access data. We could all find it right now from doing a search on the web if we chose, right? And we can pull that data into the workbench to work with it as necessary. There's type 1 data, where it's like the data that Laura just mentioned. It might be even individual level subject data that people are willing to share, but we need to keep it in a contained space so that people can actually work on it and have it in a secure environment. And then there's what we call type 2 data, which is actually data that sits somewhere else that we can access directly from the workbench so the data doesn't move. That federated approach is really the key in terms of opening up the access and the capability to collaborate, I think, across different researchers, across these different landscape resources that you saw that Nicola mentioned, and then really start to be able to tie the links, if you will, between those different bubbles that were on the COVID circle chart that Marta brought up to begin with. And importantly, then Laura just highlighted this idea that it's not an end by itself, right? This is actually a network. If you think of all those things in the landscape, we're all trying to be interconnected. And to Laura's mention of feed forward, right? The outputs of our results should feed forward into someone else's actions. They feed back and then as well into perhaps new data that needs to be collected. And so remembering that we're not the end, of the road or the end all to be all kind of resource, but part of a really interconnected network that we want to facilitate those connections on.
Thank you so much. That was a really helpful overview. Now, while we were just listening to Steve there, I think a poll should have flashed up on everybody's screen. I'm wondering if we've got any quick readouts, as we only have a few minutes left before this session actually ends. There we go. Can everybody see that? So quite a big kind of positive response for data platforms and repositories and COVID-19 data sources. So I think that's a very interesting thing. Thank you all panelists. That has been an absolutely fantastic session. Far too short. We always knew that it was going to be that way. But thank you to all the participants as well. The questions that we haven't been able to get around to answering, we will get back to you on. And I'd like to encourage everybody now to actually rejoin the main forum event. Shortly, in a couple of minutes, we're going to be starting the last session, which is going to be focusing on the launch of a new Grand Challenges pilot initiative with ICODA. So all very exciting. And you should be able to find the connections, the links to go back to the main forum on the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.